Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the World Philosophy Day 2020. We are very, very glad and happy to have this online discussion with you all. And our roundtable today, which is the second roundtable of the World Philosophy Day 2020, is entitled "The Languages of the Pandemic." And I have around me today, I'm Phinith Chanthalangsy. I'm the head of the social human sciences sector at UNESCO in Harare, speaking from Zimbabwe. I have around me and ready for this discussion, three eminent philosophers. First of all, I have Ali Benmakhlouf, who is joining us as a philosopher from Morocco and France. I also have the philosopher Divya, Dwivedi, who is joining us from India. And then last but not least, María, Lucía, Rivera, Sanín, joining us from Colombia. So I will be introducing each and every one of them as they are taking the floor. So let me just introduce the discussion today that we will be having with all three. Let me start with the words of the pandemics itself. Pandemic, first of all, tracing, pathogen, comorbidity, PCR, second wave. This is the first family. The second family, lockdown, confinement in French, isolation, quarantine, distanciation in French. We are at war, state of national disaster, état d'exception in French. And then the third family, teleworking, homeschooling. You are on mute. Is this a new hand or an old hand? I spoke to myself. So I'm sure that all of you would have heard all these words of the pandemics, languages around the pandemic that we seem to use and take it for granted for the last 8 or even 9 months. So our inquiries today will, look at three questions mainly. What do these words tell us about our world? What responsibility do we have when using languages and words to describe our reality? And at last, how can the right terminology help us take the adequate actions beyond fear and anxiety? So to start the discussion, I just would like to quote the famous philosopher of sciences, Karl Popper, who, as you know, said, if you can't say it simply and clearly, keep quiet and keep working on it until you can. So, friends and colleagues, we will be engaging around all these words of the pandemic, trying to understand and trying to see what is underlying them. First of all, it is my pleasure to introduce Ali Benmakhlouf, and at this point, let me switch to French. Ali Benmakhlouf est un professeur de philosophie à l'université Paris-Est Créteil, Val-de-Marne, mais il l'enseigne également à Sciences Po, Paris, et à l'Université libre de Bruxelles. Ali Benmakhlouf est spécialiste de la logique et de la philosophie arabe médiévale, et je voudrais également souligner qu'Ali Benmakhlouf est également membre du Conseil national des droits de l'homme du Maroc, dont il est citoyen, mais également membre de l'Académie nationale de pharmacie en France et ancien membre du Comité consultatif national d'éthique pour les sciences de la vie et de la santé. Et à ce titre, il a dirigé la rédaction de nombreux avis en bioéthique et donc en lien directement avec les problématiques de santé qui nous réunissent également aujourd'hui et bien au-delà. Donc, Ali Benmakhlouf, j'ai le plaisir de vous donner la parole pour intervenir en premier et nous allons ouvrir la discussion immédiatement après chaque intervention afin que le public puisse également manifester leurs questions en ligne que je vous relayerai quand nous venons à la discussion. Ali Benmakhlouf, à vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Chanthalangsy, pour votre introduction et pour l'aimable invitation de l'UNESCO. Je vous propose une lecture de ces mots de la pandémie en ayant sélectionné quelques-uns. Et je vais ainsi les commenter au fur et à mesure dans l'ordre alphabétique. Action, vous avez dit, Monsieur Chanthalangsy, quelle serait l'action adéquate. Le signe d'un destin commun ne se mesure pas seulement à ce que nous faisons ensemble, mais aussi à ce que nous évitons ensemble. Et la non-action que fut et qu'est maintenant le confinement, qui a été promu en forme de vie généralisée, renvoie d'abord au principe de ne pas nuire, primum non nocere. Jamais ce principe médical n'eut tant de force. C'est lui qui est devenu conducteur des autres principes d'éthique médicale, comme celui de justice, le même soin pour tous, celui de l'autonomie, une égale acceptation du confinement. Et éviter un mal escompté demande parfois plus d'efforts, on le voit, que d'agir de manière bienveillante. Et les actions que nous ne faisons pas sont, pour certains, ne semblent pas importantes. Et aussi, voudrais-je dire, toujours dans cette entrée-action, le problème de la surréaction en période de pandémie. Quand des vies sont en jeu, il est mieux d'errer du côté de la surréaction que de la sous-réaction. Et comme l'indique M. Fleurbaille, professeur à Princeton, un économiste, il dit que ceux qui diront qu'on en fait trop, quand on verra que les chiffres finaux ne sont pas très différents d'une forte grippe saisonnière, seront dans l'erreur. Pourquoi? Parce que les morts évitées n'apparaîtront pas dans les statistiques officielles. Et je crois que c'est important, cette question des morts évitées qui n'apparaissent pas dans les statistiques officielles. Deuxième mot que j'ai sélectionné, la distance et la distanciation. Il s'agit de distance physique et non pas de distance sociale, comme souvent cela a été répété avec l'anglais social distancing. On s'est habitué aussi, avec l'expression de réseaux sociaux, de neutraliser complètement le mot de social. Le lien social est tout sauf neutre. Il doit être maintenu par tous les biais possibles. Et quand on parle de distanciel, de présentiel, des mots qui se sont imposés dans les universités et dans les entreprises, il est important d'indiquer que c'est de la distance physique, mais non pas sociale. A, D, maintenant E. E comme épidémiologie. On distingue deux épidémiologies et je crois que dans le cas présent de la pandémie, cette distinction est importante. Il y a l'épidémiologie, je dirais, traditionnelle, observationnelle, celle qui collecte des données, fait le suivi d'une cohorte, analyse l'étude de cas témoins. Elle se distingue de l'épidémiologie prévisionnelle. Alors, l'épidémiologie prévisionnelle, c'est celle qui prend appui sur le développement des sciences de l'information, sur la capacité croissante de stockage et de traitement des données. Et quand il y a un déficit de données, comme dans le cas ici de la pandémie, eh bien, l'épidémiologie prévisionnelle fait appel à la modélisation, et c'est par la modélisation qu'elle parvient à compenser le déficit des données. A, action, D, distance, E, épidémiologie, I, impératif sanitaire. On l'a vu plusieurs fois, il semble qu'il y ait comme un dilemme, c'est-à-dire un choix qui se présente face à deux raisons objectives mais contradictoires, un dilemme entre l'impératif sanitaire et ce que l'on a appelé l'impératif économique. Je voudrais dire que dès le XIVe siècle, pour la grande épidémie de 1348, eh bien, la question était aussi, se protège-t-on de la famine ou se protège-t-on de la maladie? Il y a comme un balancier que rappelle le prix Nobel d'économie Esther Duflo. Les gouvernements n'ont pas d'autre choix que de desserrer un peu le cordon sanitaire, puis de nouveau de le resserrer. Et la question sous-jacente à cet impératif, c'est jusqu'où aller dans le bien-être des gens. Quel est le critère pour ce bien-être? Faut-il faire dépendre le bien-être de l'impératif sanitaire ou assouplir cet impératif en prenant le risque de ne plus accorder un prix élevé à l'espérance de vie? On le voit, la question du bien-être n'est jamais résolue d'avance. I comme impératif sanitaire, I aussi comme incertitude. Il y a de multiples incertitudes, celles qui sont liées à l'ampleur de l'épidémie, celles qui se rapportent aux mesures prises par les autorités publiques, celles qui sont relatives aux modélisations de la propagation, celles qui sont liées à la prise de décision de ces mêmes autorités publiques. Et on se demande toujours, pour une incertitude, qui communique, c'est-à-dire les personnes qui évaluent l'incertitude, quoi communiquer, sur quel objet, quelle source, quel niveau, quelle grandeur de l'incertitude, dans quelle forme, quel médium, quel format, pour quel public et à quel effet? Est-ce pour de la confiance? Est-ce pour du comportement? Est-ce pour une prise de décision? Est-ce pour la connaissance? Vous voyez, l'incertitude a de multiples facettes, mais elle ne va pas toujours de pair avec la précision. Et ce n'est pas parce qu'on manque de certitude qu'on manque de précision. Dans cette pandémie, depuis 10 mois, les précisions ont été données. Nous avons plusieurs éléments qui permettent tout de même d'agir. On connaît de quel ordre sont les difficultés respiratoires, on sait les problèmes qui adviennent au 8e, 9e jour de l'infection, on sait les risques accrus pour les personnes en surpoids et les diabétiques. On sait que les hommes sont en général plus fragiles que les femmes dans les maladies infectieuses. On sait que la contagion, en se touchant ainsi des parties du visage, après avoir été mis en contact avec le virus, eh bien, cette contagion est plus grande au début des premiers jours qu'à la fin de la maladie. Je ne vais pas égrener tout ce point, mais il importe de savoir que les scientifiques avancent en précision, même quand il leur manque la certitude, et ce n'est pas sûr que vers plus de certitude qu'il faille aller. J'en viens au risque, R comme risque. Le risque est devenu, en période pandémique, une dimension centrale des politiques publiques. C'est un événement, je le définirai comme Ulrich Beck dans son ouvrage La société du risque, un événement non encore survenu, mais qui motive l'action. Et le futur devient pour les pandémies une sorte de déterminant du présent, alors que jusqu'à présent, on est plutôt habitué à prendre appui sur les erreurs ou les succès du passé pour nous conduire, pour dicter notre conduite actuelle. Et on est peu habitué à anticiper des conséquences futures de décisions actuelles. Et c'est cette anticipation, ça fait quoi ce que j'ai dit sur les modélisations de l'épidémiologie prévisionnelle et non pas observationnelle, c'est cette anticipation qui permet l'élaboration d'hypothèses et qui devrait être plus au cœur de nos réflexions. Alors, pour le risque, toujours, qui décide de ce qu'est un risque? À quel niveau de preuve se situe le risque? Avec quelle conception de la causalité? Quelle vision de la responsabilité? Et surtout, quels sont les seuils d'acceptabilité du risque? On sait que les pays pensent mondial en termes de pandémie, mais agissent national. Vous le voyez, on accumule les vaccins sans trop de concertation entre plusieurs parties du monde. Au niveau national, la situation d'incertitude donne comme la main et la primauté aux politiques, à l'ordre politique en sécurité, pour la sécurité sanitaire. Mais en même temps, il convient d'associer les composantes de la société à la décision, sinon qu'advient-il? Et on le voit par la fragmentation de la confiance, les sentiments anti-gouvernementaux risquent d'être confondus avec les initiatives gouvernementales. Et ce n'est pas la même chose, les initiatives gouvernementales qui adviennent en temps de crise avec les sentiments anti-gouvernementaux. Et dans l'acceptabilité des risques, il est très important de se dire quelle est l'appropriation par les profanes des risques définis par les scientifiques et les pouvoirs publics. Comment précisément ces risques s'inscrivent dans leur mode de vie. J'en viens à la notion maintenant de S comme science et controverse scientifique. On le voit avec la notion de risque, reconnaître à quel moment la parole des médecins est entendue, à quel moment elle passe le relais aux décideurs politiques, est un exercice très difficile, car on ne sait jamais à l'avance quel est le moment opportun pour une décision qui concerne la santé de tous au sujet d'une pandémie qui garde encore ses zones d'ombre. Quelle est cette obligation d'action? Vous avez parlé, M. Chanthalangsy, de l'action adéquate, mais moi je dirais aussi la notion de l'obligation à agir sur fond d'incertitude. Et le débat public et argumenté reste le garant de ce moment opportun d'action. Et le chemin, bien sûr, est tortueux, mais quand il n'est pas tortueux, c'est beaucoup plus grave parce qu'on peut penser qu'on n'est plus du tout en démocratie. Est-ce aussi comme santé? Ma formation de base est la philosophie, même si c'est la philosophie des sciences, mais de tout ce que j'ai pu lire, c'est que la santé est toujours présentée comme le seul idéal admissible auquel ce que l'on appelle un homme ait le droit d'aspirer. J'ai cité Jacques Rivera en 1924. Mais le problème, c'est que quand elle est d'emblée donnée dans un être, elle lui cache la moitié du monde. Et ce qui se passe avec cette pandémie, c'est que précisément, comme elle n'est plus d'emblée donnée, elle rend visible cette moitié du monde que nous ne voyons pas quand nous sommes en bonne santé. Elle est aussi caractérisée, la santé, comme le principal de tous les biens, je cite Descartes, et le fondement de tous les autres. Pour commencer à parler des autres biens, il faut d'abord s'assurer qu'on a le principal et le fondement de ces biens, à savoir précisément la santé. J'en viens, puisqu'il ne me reste pas beaucoup de temps, à deux dernières entrées, le tracking digital et les vulnérabilités. Le tracking digital, on l'entend sur les ondes en ce moment en France, tester, alerter, protéger, trois verbes qui sont régulièrement donnés. Les épidémiologistes, quant à eux, parlent aussi de trois autres verbes. Surveiller, tracer, isoler. Le problème, c'est que certains citoyens, par crainte d'un usage excessivement sécuritaire de ces verbes, voient advenir une société de contrôle et de réduction des libertés. Et on peut espérer qu'une délibération publique ne veut pas dire toujours étatique, loin de là, qu'une délibération publique réduise les malentendus et la méfiance sans jamais prétendre accorder tout à fait une société aux moyens qu'elle engage. Parce que si on n'a pas un minimum de désaccord et d'inadéquation, on n'a plus les signes démocratiques et c'est cette difficulté qui est importante. Le tracking digital, c'est quoi? C'est une application qui informe si une personne a été en contact avec une personne infectée avec le virus, et cette application va bien au-delà des actions préventives relatives au masque ou au dépistage. Comment faire confiance à la finalité spécifique de ce tracking digital? Quel est l'usage au-delà de la finalité sanitaire? Est-ce qu'il y a des traces qui peuvent être après utilisées par des grandes plateformes? Est-ce que les assurances vont pouvoir détourner les finalités de ce tracking? Ce sont des questions très, très importantes. Dernier volet, les vulnérabilités. Faut-il ici égrener toutes les vulnérabilités rendues soudainement visibles dès lors que la moitié du monde ne nous est plus cachée, comme dit Jacques Rivera, par la possession de la santé. Vulnérabilité des femmes soumises à la violence conjugale suite au confinement. Vulnérabilité des enfants pauvres, déscolarisés, habitant avec des parents analphabètes, dans des habitats denses, insalubres, sans moyens technologiques pour un enseignement à distance, mais aussi désocialisés, déscolarisés, désocialisés. Là, ce sont les grandes vulnérabilités. La pandémie a fait prendre conscience du rôle de l'école comme institution sociale, institution protectrice, tout autant que comme institution pédagogique. Et me vient, pour finir, le mot de Bachelard qui disait que la société est faite pour l'école et non pas l'école pour la société. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Ali Benmakhlouf, pour votre intervention, pour cette formidable abécédaire à la façon de Gilles Deleuze. C'est extrêmement dense, en même temps très précis, comme nous avons vu, et également parfaitement ponctuel, puisque vous avez observé un peu moins même de 20 minutes. Je vous remercie énormément. Débat public, délibération, société de contrôle de l'autre côté de la médaille, mais aussi modélisation avec les précisions, qui ne veut pas dire pour autant certitude, distanciation physique et non pas distanciation sociale. Voilà toutes les problématiques qui émergent à travers votre abécédaire. Et donc, je vous remercie vraiment pour avoir structuré toutes les problématiques que nous devons débattre aujourd'hui ensemble. Sans plus tarder, je voudrais voir s'il y a maintenant des questions qui ont été posées après cette première intervention. Si ce n'est pas le cas, ce n'est pas du tout grave. Nous pouvons procéder à la prochaine intervention et nous ramasserons les questions au fur et à mesure. Donc, je voudrais savoir de la part de mes collègues, est-ce qu'il y a eu déjà des questions posées? Bien, je crois que pour l'instant, le public est encore timide. Je vous invite à vraiment poser les questions dans la case questions et réponses. En attendant, de ma part, je voudrais poser à Ali Benmakhlouf la question suivante, afin que peut-être dans un deuxième temps, il puisse revenir sur la notion. Je sais que vous travaillez beaucoup sur la notion de conversation. Et puisque nous parlons des maux de la pandémie, je voudrais vous poser la question de savoir qu'est-ce que révèle cette impossibilité de commercer actuellement à cause du confinement, à cause de ce qu'on appelle lockdown, ce manque de commerce entre nous, humains. Qu'est-ce qu'il révèle de la valeur de la conversation? Quelle est la valeur de la conversation que parfois nous ne saisissons pas forcément parce que nous avons la possibilité de commercer au sens large. Maintenant que nous n'avons plus cette possibilité-là, eh bien, qu'est-ce que de quoi nous prenons conscience quant à la valeur de la conversation?
Merci beaucoup de votre question. Oui, il est vrai que cette question de la conversation, j'y ai consacré plusieurs écrits. Je dirais trois choses rapidement. Premièrement, les hommes tiennent les uns aux autres par la parole. Je cite Montaigne, on tient par la parole, on se soutient par la parole. Et cette tenue de l'humanité par la parole est un enjeu très, très important. Et donc, quand il y a une faille dans cette tenue, il y a quelque chose qui déchoit de notre image de l'humanité. On tient les uns les autres par la parole. Deuxièmement, la conversation assure une forme de réciprocité, précisément avec une forme de réciprocité avec les autres. Je m'explique. La parole appartient moitié à celui qui la dit, moitié à celui qui l'écoute. Et dans cette moitié-moitié, nous faisons l'expérience de l'égalité. Nous faisons l'expérience de quelque chose qui nous met en pleine réciprocité. Et je crois que quand les inégalités explosent partout, qu'elles soient économiques ou de genre, il est très important de rappeler cette forme de moitié-moitié de la parole conversée. Et le troisième point, eh bien, il y a dans cette forme de réciprocité comme un magnétisme où non seulement on tient les uns aux autres par la parole, mais on se joint, on s'attache. Il y a des formes, si vous voulez, au-delà de la conversation, qui font naître des amitiés, voire des amours. Et là, c'est des formes, je pèse mon mot, quasiment des formes de magnétisation des uns par les autres grâce à la conversation.
Merci beaucoup, Ali, de rappeler effectivement la centralité de la conversation. Je voudrais vous poser des questions maintenant qui commencent à arriver. Une première question pour vous demander de revenir sur la notion de vulnérabilité. Pourriez-vous développer quelles sont ces formes de vulnérabilité selon vous? Et paradoxalement, ne pourrait-on pas envisager que ces formes de vulnérabilité, en quelque sorte, eh bien, deviennent des forces? Le participant ou la participante demande comment repenser notre monde qui n'aime pas, entre guillemets, les faibles.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour cette question majeure. Les formes de vulnérabilité, elles sont très nombreuses. Je ne les rattache pas. Il y a la vulnérabilité métaphysique qui fait que nous sommes des êtres finis et que nous allons disparaître un jour. Je ne rattache pas la vulnérabilité à la finitude. Je rattache la vulnérabilité à la notion de capacité. De quoi nous sommes privés pour faire. Et cette privation de capacité, pour moi, c'est véritablement ce qui oriente la vulnérabilité dans ses diverses formes, puisque vous m'interrogez sur ces formes. Il y a bien évidemment la vulnérabilité, je l'ai dit, des personnes qui ont un travail précaire et qui l'ont perdu. Il y a la vulnérabilité de toutes celles qui sont laissées sur le carreau dès lors qu'elles n'ont pas les protections sociales et étatiques importantes. Il y a les vulnérabilités de l'habitat dense où, en cette situation où beaucoup de personnes sont confinées, il n'y a pas la possibilité de jouir de l'espace public, de jouir des situations où nous retrouvons des formes de publicité et le fait d'être recroquevillé sur un habitat dense multiplie précisément les vulnérabilités. Et il y a, bien évidemment, je le disais, les vulnérabilités de genre, c'est des vulnérabilités très, très importantes, où, précisément, comme le disait Madame Françoise Héritier, la discrimination universelle de quelque pays que l'on vienne, la discrimination universelle, c'est la discrimination à l'égard, précisément, des femmes. Et en cette période où il y a eu tant de relâchement dans la scolarisation, il me semble que l'on peut mettre en avant précisément la vulnérabilité des personnes déscolarisées, des personnes qui précisément ne parviennent pas à se connecter à un enseignement, avoir un outil comme un ordinateur, c'est loin d'être donné à toutes les personnes. Et à partir de là, malheureusement, les vulnérabilités s'additionnent et s'accumulent et il n'est pas sûr qu'on puisse si facilement les reprendre. Quant à l'autre volet de la question, peuvent-elles être une force? Elles ne peuvent être des forces que si elles permettent une forme de vigilance pour les combattre. Quand on pointe les vulnérabilités, c'est pour lever toutes les privations de capacité et non pas précisément pour avoir juste un regard compassionnel ou sur les personnes vulnérables. Plus on reconnaît les vulnérabilités, plus on doit se donner de moyens pour les lever. Et ça me permet de dire, je l'ai dit rapidement, toutes les actions qui sont utiles et publiques ne sont pas nécessairement des actions venant de l'État. C'est très important que l'État agisse, mais je crois qu'il est aussi important important de dissocier la notion de public de la notion d'étatique pour dire que nous avons plusieurs formes, par les associations notamment, par la société civile, d'organiser des moyens qui permettent précisément de combattre ces vulnérabilités, mais ces associations doivent être garanties par l'État et non pas censurées par lui, comme cela arrive souvent. On doit laisser la société civile organiser des actions publiques et ne pas la censurer dans les formes de solidarité qu'elle cherche à inventer.
Merci beaucoup, Ali, pour ces précisions sur les vulnérabilités, sur les inégalités également qui traversent nos sociétés, d'autant plus que nous nous enfermons dans le confinement dans plusieurs pays. Je voudrais également vous soumettre une question, mais en attendant, je voudrais dire aussi que à María, Lucía et Divya, que vous pouvez également participer à la conversation. Nous allons aller entendre vos présentations dans quelques temps, mais nous avons encore 10 minutes pour discuter de la présentation de Ali, donc n'hésitez pas à intervenir également. Une question, Ali, encore que nous avons reçue. La classification ou la taxinomie que vous avez proposée à travers cet abécédaire, dans quelle mesure vous trouvez ou pas que les gouvernants, les décideurs politiques sont précis ou se saisissent de cette précision nécessaire dans leur action politique ou dans leurs mesures, dans les mesures qu'ils ont prises jusqu'à maintenant? Est-ce qu'ils en font usage de cette précision du langage?
Il me semble qu'effectivement, ils ont en tous les cas à être précis. Je crois que derrière la précision, vous savez, ce qui est visé, c'est la confiance des individus pour que ce que j'ai appelé les initiatives gouvernementales, quelles que soient les orientations des gouvernements, mais les initiatives gouvernementales en période précisément de pandémie, que ces initiatives puissent rencontrer l'acceptabilité et la confiance du grand nombre. Mais la confiance et l'acceptabilité du grand nombre doit précisément s'associer à la possibilité de dire à un certain moment « je ne sais pas ». À un certain moment, mais les gouverneurs et les décideurs politiques ont beaucoup de mal à dire « je ne sais pas ». Mais « je ne sais pas » ne doit pas être un facteur d'angoisse. « Je ne sais pas », comme je le disais, c'est de dire il y a pour autant des actions fragmentaires et précises que nous devons mener. Vous savez, quand les ondes américaines disent à propos du masque, ceci est un masque, ceci n'est pas un bulletin de vote, c'est très important. Ça va à cette précision-là, à des choses que tout le monde peut comprendre pour ne pas approprier dans le domaine de la politique politicienne les initiatives gouvernementales liées à la manière de faire face à la pandémie. Mais il me semble, il est vrai, que à la fois, et c'est la difficulté du gouvernement en période de pandémie, à la fois la main est donnée aux politiques, il y a une primauté du politique en période de sécurité sanitaire, cela va de soi, mais en même temps, cette primauté ne signifie pas la décision seule est en centralité. Primauté ne signifie pas centralité. Primauté, ça signifie simplement j'ai la main, mais je vous associe, vous, toute la population, en multipliant les forums, en faisant remonter au maximum la manière dont les individus entendent telle ou telle mesure prise. Je ne dis pas que c'est facile, mais je pense que là aussi la précision vient du fait que la primauté, vous avez soulevé dans votre introduction l'état d'exception ou l'état d'urgence, toutes ces questions d'urgence et d'exception ne doivent pas s'accompagner d'un abus de pouvoir et c'est cette limite, cette ligne de crête entre agir en urgence et ne pas monopoliser l'action qui est très importante. Et c'est pourquoi je disais qu'il fallait que les gouverneurs et les décideurs publics autorisent autant que possible l'action publique indépendante de l'action étatique pour que cette action publique, je dis bien publique et non pas des lobbies, etc., mais une action publique où les individus se sentent à même de pouvoir manifester leur solidarité.
Merci beaucoup, Ali. Now that we have nearly concluded this first presentation, I'd like to make sure that Divya or Lucía, do you want to jump in at this stage on any concept or ideas you'd like to contribute to?
I'm very embarrassed to say that it takes me a lot of attention and I have to listen very slowly to follow the lecture in French. And that is my hesitation. So I think I will I will not ask a question at this stage. I would have to listen to the lecture recording.
Yes, that is also part of the challenge of languages, diversity of languages, which we are grappling with. So, je voudrais remercier Ali Benmakhlouf encore une fois pour cette intervention initiale extrêmement riche et structurant, je dirais, par rapport à notre débat d'aujourd'hui. J'ai quelques questions encore que nous continuons à recevoir dans la case de questions-réponses. Je les amènerai dans notre discussion un peu plus tard. Je voudrais maintenant donner la parole à Divya Dwivedi. Let me switch to English now. Let me invite our second guest, Divya Dwivedi, to come in. So let me introduce her before she takes to the floor. Divya Dwivedi is a philosopher from India. She's teaching as professor of philosophy at the Indian Institute of Technology in New Delhi. And with UNESCO, she has been very, very active in pushing forward the UNESCO Women Philosophers Journal, which she has been the main editor of the 4th issue, dedicated to, and I quote, intellectuals, philosophers, women in India, endangered species. Let me also share that Professor Dwivedi has dedicated many research in narratology and literary theory, with a particular focus as well on the post-colonial theory. So, Professor Dwivedi, you have the floor now to share with us your presentation in 20 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Phinith, and John Crowley and Camille for inviting me to participate in this meditation, which attempts to understand yet another dimension of what we have experienced through the pandemic and what we can learn about ourselves in this period. Your question for this evening is prefaced by the statement that the pandemic is all about language, and it is true. But I would like to explore further how we understand the term language, and then go on to think about what are the ways and levels at which the pandemic is all about language, in what definition and what understanding of language. How should we understand this term? There is one level, and of course in philosophy, attention has always been paid and attempts have been made to distinguish levels at which we use the word language. And one of those has been what Heidegger would call a stock of words and syntactical rules, or what Gilles Deleuze would call language is that which has signs at its disposal. But that is not the only level of language that we have as a concern when we think of the pandemic. We also have learned from analyses of language, such as Austin's, where we could observe the distinction between the constative and the performative, and at the same time also observe the way in which it was not a firm distinction. And it alerted us to the ways in which the use of language also effectuates reality. And simultaneously, in the study of narrative, which is now becoming more and more ubiquitous in trying to understand the relationship between language, sense, and life, one had started with a distinction between that which has happened and the way we speak about it. But we know that, in fact, there is no 0 degree of separation between the things that happen and the way we speak about them. And this necessary discrepancy between the two is at the same time something that does not have the character of a delay. We can't simply say that it's a matter of being belated or having hindsight, because there is this other dimension, which is a creative expectation that generates often what will happen. And this is also the level at which many of the experiences of the pandemic are related to the language that has been used. To understand this better and to understand the examples with which Phinith had started, for instance, words like isolation, lockdown, quarantine, disaster, state of exception, we know again that there have been analyses of what is called genres of discourse, or speech genres, as Bakhtin called them. And these are again aspects of language that are observable, they are classifiable. One can therefore begin to sense the levels at which language also has effects of power and how it organizes social and political relationships, and the way in which language is also the site where contestations of power take place. But we also know from Derrida and his engagement with both the concepts of narrative and the concepts of genre, that while we can try and analyze the genres which are audible and observable in the language that we use around us, there is at the same time always a point of impossibility in classifying these genres. And that is the point at which any genre of speech, whether it's what can be called ordinary language or what could be called clear speech, something that you mentioned, Phinith, it runs into a point where genres can no longer be grounded in their distinctions. And there is a fictive narrativity, as Derrida called it, at the very heart of the law of genre. But having had the hindsight with the help of these meditations on the character of language that I very quickly rehearsed, we are still concerned with where we stand within the language that organizes the world, or the world during the time of the pandemic, and the world disclosed by the pandemic. And if we can discern certain categories, certain uses of terms that seem to participate in the ways in which the pandemic has created misery for large parts of the world, and also the ways in which the pandemic is itself the result of the systemic, institutional generation of this misery over a much longer period than now, then there is yet another dimension of language that that we may have to explore, and that is what I would like to think about further for the rest of the duration. And perhaps one could start by considering how what is at stake is not the language of the pandemic as such. Rather, what is at stake is the categories through which we make sense. And what is at stake for us, for instance, in an evening like this, is what is the provenance of these categories? And even more than that, what are their powers and what are their futures? And this is one sense that we are concerned with the most. I'm sure that the word future can be counted in the list with which we began this evening. But what does this future mean? And how can one have a sense of the future in language? Does language itself have a sense of the future beyond the categories that we can already analyze? And that means that we have to think about the unborn categories, categories that are yet to be invented in relation to whatever we can analyze, understand, comprehend about the language of the pandemic today. I call them categories because the categories with which we have made sense of the pandemic and beyond that are analogically distributable, and they cover a range of phenomena. And therefore, they are categories in the sense in which Kant had used the term categories as well, although the categories themselves are different. But beyond having this analogical power, whereby the same term can be attributed to otherwise extremely different phenomena over a range of experiences over time, there is another aspect of these categories. They also have homological powers. And I would like to explain what I mean by this distinction and the combination of the analogical and the homological powers of categories. As we know, the term category is derived from the Greek verb and the Greek word categoria, where it has both the sense of predication, but also the sense of accusation. It is derived specifically from the words kata, which refers to against or accordance with, and on the other hand, the root agoruo, which refers to speaking in public. And therefore, as was discussed by both Heidegger and Derrida, the term category and the verb to categorize derive from words that refer to accusing, to making a charge which must be answered for. And in that sense, of course, one could say that categories are dialogical, but what exactly makes them dialogical, and in what way is it possible to speak back when called upon by an accusation or a charge or a call in such a way that something that is yet unborn, something especially which we experience at the time of what is often called a crisis, as these times are, is what we then need to think about. So I once again think of these terms like isolation or lockdown, disaster, states of exception, and especially war. This, as we know, is not the first time that the word war has been used along with the word crisis to describe a certain moment where certain powers come together to make sense of a situation and act in that situation. And therefore, that situation is already composed of a number of different components which are of unequal power, which have different, which perform different functions. And we have heard of the word war also in the case of the war on terror. We have heard of the term in the case of the war on drugs. And therefore, an analysis of how many of these words function has been available to us for a long time. And keeping that in mind, when we reflect again on the experience of the past few months, we certainly recognize that war does allow states to implement measures which are required in the case of war. So similar measures can be marshaled and deployed and implemented with force in times that are either described by analogy with war, or where very similar laws or laws having a relation to emergency powers are implemented. But at the same time, the pandemic has also demonstrated that despite the metaphor of war, countries have been forced to cooperate with each other as well. They have not, in fact, been at war, and sections of society themselves are not only embedded in a situation of war, because the situation itself is become much more complex, but the idea and the necessity of cooperation has become as prominent as that of war. And that is something that calls us to think about what it reveals about the world. Countries have cooperated on scientific and medical research. They've had to cooperate in terms of trade and movement and commerce of goods, especially protective equipment, which was needed during the pandemic. And then in relation to this idea of an analogy of war, another term that we have heard a lot, and it was mentioned earlier, is states of exception. On the one hand, the pandemic has demonstrated the withdrawal and failure of states in many parts of the world to fulfill the promises in the name of which states have a right to exist at all. And on the other hand, of course, there has been an implementation of these emergency powers which come with the declaration of a state of exception in many ways. So how do these two facets of what we have experienced make sense together? And again, what do they tell us about the world disclosed by the pandemic? Can we analyze the relation of the people of the world to the various state powers, to the state governments, through what we have received as analysis of the states of exception, simply because they have been invoked once again, especially the analyses that were developed in the 20th century. Because we are also challenged to make sense of this new phenomena that states which have declared or states of exception or have acted in that manner have in fact failed to deploy any powers and to act as a state does. So the state in withdrawal seems to be incommensurate with the idea of a state of exception. But above all, there's one other thing that the pandemic has disclosed to us that tells us something about the categories through which we make sense and through which we hope to make sense in the future and of our own future. And it is that the pandemic has unavoidably made palpable the fact that we are today a one world system, no doubt because of the long period of what is called globalization, which could be defined in several ways. There is no one objectivity corresponding to the term globalization, which also makes it a difficult term, one which we should have a lot of care before we use it. But we do realize now more than ever that the whole world has been affected, not just by the pandemic, but by pre-existing situations and pre-existing conditions and arrangements, which even permitted the pandemic to come about. And it has also shown us the reality that any solutions to the material problems that we have faced, which have been faced together, is the solution that involves everyone. And perhaps even solution is not the right term for it, but it does remind us that we cannot look away or look back from the kind of world that we all form together, everyone in every part of the planet. And this one world system, at the same time, continues to reveal something before the pandemic and during the pandemic, which is that these conditions through which the pandemic developed are those which have been swiftly decided upon and then implemented without the participation of the world. And this category then of the world and of people, of the whole, or what could be called the pan, is something that is a deeper part of the language of the pandemic, perhaps not the audible part of the discourse used by one section of the world, but this is the deeper structure of language through which, as Heidegger said, it's language that speaks through us. It's not we who manipulate or handle words or deploy words as tools in order to achieve certain effects alone. In this sense, the world's population is unable to understand the dimension where the decisions affecting the whole world are made. Most of us don't even understand the technicalities of economic and technological decisions through which the world is being run. And we also don't find the possibility of participating in a discussion, let alone in these decisions. And yet, once we recognize that we are this one world system with its distributed parts, with its components, and we are comprehended by this one world system, then this is something that also reflects in the language through which we understand our lives and through which we understand the world. This one world system affects every aspect of our lives, and it shows that although not yet, nevertheless, we are capable of thinking of a democracy of the world, in this sense that it is equally a question of who gets to participate at the level of the language and the categories through which the world is going to be run, through which it makes sense, who is going to be excluded from that discussion and through what means. And therefore, with this thought itself, the first step is taken, and we have become capable of thinking of a democracy of the world in which we all can participate for the future of the whole world. And at the same time, of course, this is also the period in which we have become aware of the way in which the older order still continues to hold sway in some aspects of the way of the world. And it still persists. And that is another level of the categories, which in particular I refer to as the homological powers of the categories through which we make sense of the pandemic and which organize the pandemic. In that sense, one can say that we do experience a crisis of language, if one wants to use the word crisis, and not only the crisis that we, of course, recognize as the pandemic. But what does it mean and what does it imply for our ability to imagine a different future and for us as the world to imagine it for ourselves as the world? What we are undergoing today, in this sense, and in this experience of a crisis of language, is something that I would like to call, using an analogy from the pandemic itself, from the language of the pandemic itself, I would like to call the great isolation. It is not the isolation, or it's not only the isolation which such a large part of the world had to undergo simultaneously while being separated in the most excruciating ways. We experienced together this isolation. But I would also like to think of another level of isolation, which is one of the categories themselves, or us together as the world becoming isolated or confined to certain categories of the past, categories that perhaps might not accurately reflect what it is that is underway right now. And
Divya,
this crisis
I invite you to conclude. Sorry to interject.
Yes. Let me say very quickly then what this relation between analogies and homologies is. The power to imagine and the power which effectuates anything is developed through two operations of the imagination. And it develops them with respect to what is given. One of them is analogy and the other is homology. New constructions are made possible by the imaginative work of perceiving a homology. A homology is the discernment of the kinds and degrees of articulations that are available in things as they already are. But there are the possibilities of new kinds of articulation. To develop the power of the construction of new realities, concrete new relations have to be imagined between the things that are already there, that are given. And they have to be materially constructed, and given our desires, we would like to make them durable. This is the actual material work of imagination that we are obligated by. But to imagine the new ends and the new forms in which to re-articulate the given, imagination also perceives the given with a freedom. And this is the freedom that comes through the counterpart of the power of homology, which is analogy. Analogy is quite beyond and apart from the analogies that we have just spoken of. It's the knowledge of the freedom of functions, that the same term, the same category can function in more ways than one. It can regroup under its abstractive and you could say accusatory power, very diverse things and newer things, which means that a thing for which many functions are homologically possible in its powers are restricted or functionally isolated for only a selected set of activities. And the power of the freedom of imagination is to imagine these new restrictions, which are new constructions. And in that sense, liberty is not the liberty from all these ways of thinking. So I would like to end on this note to remind ourselves that in more ways than one, we are undergoing a great isolation, and that the categories that we have inherited perhaps are inadequate to the one world system that we already are. What is demanded is new means and new ends, which we must imagine. Because the world, of course, at any time is made up both of old components and the new ones, and the ones that are yet to be born. None of these components are comprehended by the same terms through which we had analyzed the last century, whether that is globalization or states of exception or colonialism. They are comprehended by something else which we have to strain to try and understand. They are comprehended by something whose outline might not yet be available to us, because we have not yet started imagining it collectively, but it will be visible to future generations, and perhaps those generations will look back on this time and call it the era of the great isolation. Thank you. And apologies for having taken extra time.
Thank you very much, Divya. You have taken 3 minutes more, but so it is totally fine. Thank you so much for this intervention that brings us to look at the narratology tool that we also have at our disposal to analyze and to attempt to analyze the situation we are living in. Thank you so much for reminding us that there's no 0 degree when we use languages to describe or to prescribe or to predicate the reality. So I think it is very important for us to take note of that, and your proposal to inquire on what does mean today a great isolation for us, and also your invitation to use imagination moving forward and looking ahead. So I think there's already a question coming up in the chat box, asking you and also challenging you, I would say, to just discuss with us what would you imagine as the unborn categories that you are alluding to. Could you bring us through the kind of imagination that would come up when you think of unborn categories that we could use to describe our world out of this great isolation? Over to you, Divya.
Whatever I'm going to say will be under the mark of a necessary hesitation to propose individually any category that can stand in for the whole world. It is something that when I say that it is something that we have to imagine together, for me, let me say that is the first category. A term like together or a term like the world, we have received analyses of the world, and of course, when one examines the writings of Martin Heidegger or Hannah Arendt or a number of other philosophers, one can immediately see that the world is a category that did not always exist. There was a time in the history of thought or in the history of philosophy that the world is a category that was necessary to think came into being. I could, of course, list many conventional categories, but including the word category. But the very term imagination is yet another category that is, I would like to think, a young one. At least it's in the 18th century philosophical writings that it acquires the status of a category that can help to make distinctions. So the world is a word which is old, now old for us in the 21st century, but can we think of it again? When we use a word like together, again, we have the analyses of Mitsein, for instance, but can we think of it in a way that makes sense of where we are today? For me, the idea of proposing and developing categories has to start from this itself. But for that, not only in a time where we are isolated physically and we are pressed to communicate with each other through the digital media, which, as we remember, is something not available to many parts of the world. It's not available to many of my students. So how is it possible then to speak of being together and of discussing with each other? There is beyond the question of medium an even bigger question, which is that in our systems of education, especially at a time where teaching and learning has moved online, and that was another term that you had mentioned while explaining the theme of this evening, is it's a time in which we are looking back nostalgically at the university of the 1960s and 70s, but that institution is also vanishing. It's under enormous duress, and we are all transitioning into something which seems to be, towards which we seem to be only receptive. We don't have any active relation to it. We are able to speak about it in exactly the same way that we spoke of it earlier, but we are not able to participate in shaping it. Or where we do strive to shape new institutions and new ways of engaging with each other and speaking with each other, we are not able yet to make them durable. So it's not, and this was my point, it's not a question of a word anymore, but it's a question of a whole structure of categorization, or categorizing in Greek. And that is what I would like to say on this occasion. But I think the time is almost on us, or is very soon, where we will have to propose these new terms, which may very well have old names. A new term like world, a new term like freedom, which I didn't also have the time to go into, and its relationship to a homology.
Thank you so much, Divya. You know that as you are speaking, using narratology as a tool to use various nuances to capture and elaborate on our reality, there's a question that comes up as well, asking whether what you are telling us sounds like a political philosophy, on top of being, using narratology as a tool. You are inviting us also to move into political philosophy. What do you think of that? And in the same sense, I remember that Kant, for instance, defines art as the imagination without concept. And I wonder to what extent aesthetics could also be another way for us to imagine the world that is still unborn. So between narratology, political philosophy, and aesthetics, how do you think we should use those tools to better imagine the unborn categories? Over to you.
Thank you. It's a very big question, and I wish that the format of this seminar had suddenly magically turned into something where I had half an hour to talk about this relationship and to elaborate further on the terms that I just touched upon, which is the relation between analogies and homologies, and the way in which they necessitate the isolation of functions. Let me start from the last thing that you mentioned, which is aesthetics. We know that aesthetics is the domain of freedom, even if it does not immediately have any impact, and even if it is purposeless, as something that was recognized a long time ago, much like philosophy, whose purpose immediately cannot be cited or defended. And that's why these are also very imperiled zones. But aesthetic is the domain of where extreme freedoms, very high degrees of freedoms can be taken with whatever is given. It can be defamiliarized, it can be combined with other things, and the discovery of the new possibilities through these combinations and these distortions and defamiliarizations is enormous. And yet, art is a most fragile thing. We again could speak of institutions of art. We could speak of the lives of artists, which are more and more imperiled in the present economic and political conditions. And the aesthetic possibilities of speech and expression are unable to last in the same way in which the arrangements of power last in the world. The more durable arrangements, the more tenacious arrangements, and those in which, again, we don't have a participative role. But nevertheless, art reminds us of this high degree of freedom, which I would like to call, based on a long work which I conducted with the philosopher Shaj Mohan, and which was published not too long ago. I would like to call it a polynomia, which means the possibility of multiple laws. Who legislates these laws in the work of art is the artist, and the relation between the artist and the one who views or listens or participates in the work of art is the viewer. But in the case of the genres of discourse, where structures of power circulate, we find that we have very little freedom, and therefore one could say that there is a much lower degree of polynomia. And simply the task of interpretation alone, or even analysis alone, is not going to change this degree of polynomia. So we need to imagine at the level of these materialities, how it's possible for us together to legislate new laws, new norms, for the one world that we are. In that sense, it's not only the artist who's a legislator, but it's all of us who form the world and who today should and do insist on a democratic future of the whole world, not just a democracy which is confined to nation states. Because that vision is not only old, it is the very vision that produces enormous disparities of power and well-being. So it's a radically different imagination for us to think of being the legislators of a new world. So you are right that this is a question of aesthetics and of political philosophy, provided we recognize the two, perhaps to use aesthetics as a training ground for our imagination, which is why engagement with art and literature is so necessary today. But to go all the way to the experimentations in our personal lives or in our social lives, which is where we, for the past several decades, have developed a new level of expression about and discovery and legislation of new forms of loves. We have discovered new forms of bodies for which we can demand more rights, new forms of speech for which we can demand new rights. So we are already inventive. It's a question to come back to narrative. And here, although narrative is a part of literature, I will say very quickly that we know enough on the basis of Paul Ricoeur and also on the other hand, Jean Derrida, that narratives are not the most polynomic forms. For the most part, narratives can be can have very low degrees of freedom from functional isolation. They are isolated very quickly into genres, their beginning, middle, and end, and their schematization of time such that the passage of time means something is too conservative and too conventional. So this is just a glimpse of the complex interrelationships between the fields of philosophy, aesthetics, and narrative. In that sense, I would just say that the analysis that I wanted to share today is not itself narratological. Narratology can be analyzed in terms of homologies and analogies, but these are not narratological tools. And we do need to put narratology under the lens once again.
Thank you so much, Divya. Since we have still 2 minutes to go, I can see that María Lucía is also asking for the floor. So I'm very happy that we have also a conversation between speakers. And then Lucía, please go ahead.
Yes, well, Divya, it's always a pleasure listening to you, and your ideas are always they're very suggestive. I have perhaps just a very simple question, and what you speak of, this kind of very contradictory thing of a globalized world becoming one, and producing a great isolation, which seems to be, you know, the production of a contradiction, just makes the question about whether what comes next, to use the expression by Arturo Escobar, another world is possible, whether you're thinking about or whether you think it is possible or desirable that this new world and this end of the world, there's, yeah, maybe you've seen it, a graffiti that became viral, another end of the world is possible. Whether you think this kind of new world that will arise will be one world, because one of the things I'm very worried about, and I think you've mentioned it, is the kind of colonial logic, the kind of impairment on a democratic, you know, choosing of the categories to make sense. Do you think that is giving way to a new united, you know, a kind of unitary world, or what we're going to see, or do you think that this great isolation will continue to isolate and divide? That would be my question.
Thank you.
Divya, you have a big challenge here, because we've reached, you maybe have less than a minute to answer.
If you think
then we
it's
can continue
better
the conversation with María Lucía.
Yes, I will look forward to that. But thank you, Lucía, for the question. And it's really nice to see you again and to talk to you about these things.
Right. So, Ana Lucía, what I propose is that we reserve your question, which is a very, very big one, for our discussion when we come at the end of your presentation. So, Divya, hold on, gather your ideas, and we engage on this question immediately after María Lucía presents. So, thank you so much, Divya. Let me now invite María Lucía to come in. María Lucía Rivera Sanín is from Colombia. She's a philosopher, assistant professor in the Department of Bioethics at El Bosque University, but also associate professor in the Faculty of Philosophy and Humanities in the University of La Salle, Bogota, in Colombia. And she is specialized in contemporary ethics and political philosophy, which is why it is a very smooth transition from Divya, with also a very interesting feminist perspectives. So, María Lucía, you have the floor now to take us through one of the main questions, I think. How should we understand what is implied by the current discursive devices that are used around the pandemic? What is the influence of our history, of our political conflict on this particular language around the pandemic? The floor is yours, María Lucía.
Well, thank you, Phinith, and thank you to UNESCO for this invitation. It is always a great honor to be accompanied by such great philosophers and thinkers. My presentation today has to do with the kind of political connections and semantic connections between the way in which the media and governments, especially in the Latin American context, and most especially in Colombia, have spoken about and around the pandemic, have deployed a kind of way of speaking that I think fortifies and perpetuates a status quo, which is very dangerous because it is based on mutual suspicion, it is based on vigilance, it is based on xenophobia, aporophobia, which means, you know, the phobia of the poor people, and another group of very different things that have a special nuance in Colombian and Latin American contexts. I want to start, I think, by saying that these discursive devices are not exclusive to the Latin American or Colombian contexts, and many of the ways in which we speak about the pandemic are, in a sense, imported from the discussions from the first world, but they acquire a very specific sense and a very specific kind of pragmatic consequence in our country, in countries like ours. one of the first things to say, and to connect with what Divya has said before, is that I think it's very important to notice that despite using the same terms, there are a lot of things that are lost in translation, because the use of a term, of course, is contextual, and it is linked to an emotive and cognitive state of the people, of the users of a language. And we in Colombia have a very different emotional connection, for example, with the term war, as what somebody from a country that has not been at an internal war for the better part of a century might have. As Divya had said, the war on terror and the war on drugs, which are both wars that are being waged in Colombia for decades now, have a different resonance, a different emotive resonance on Colombian people than on, for example, people from the United States or the European Union, because it is not the same to be the one who wages the war and to be somebody who lives on the territory where the war is waged. So when we speak about the pandemic as a war, Colombian people, and I think this might be shared with people from other political Souths and other territories in dispute, have a very special way, particular way of understanding what that means. I will speak about three different types of discursive devices that are set in motion by the pandemic. They are not originated by the pandemic. They are not new forms of discourse, but they have been strengthened, so to speak, by the pandemic, by the conditions that the pandemic shows, by the conditions that the pandemic establishes, and by the conditions that the pandemic uh, allows us to imagine for the future. So the first one is a kind of discourse that Colombian philosopher Ángela Uribe has analyzed in various texts from her, which is the humiliating discourse. This is a way of speaking, of using certain terms in order to take out of the political and the social community certain groups or certain people. In the pandemic, humiliating discourse has had the basic attribute of being connected to contagion. So it kind of displays a way of taking out of what Divya has called the democratic process of assigning sense or constructing categories, groups or individuals. And this process has not been haphazard. It has not been random. It follows certain logics. On the one hand, the Colombian government, the vice president, has called people from impoverished zones of the country who have protested, who have asked for help in terms of solutions for impoverishment, for very precarious conditions. She has called poor people atenidos. And this is a Spanish term, which is very hard to translate. It has no translation, actually. It just means somebody who's living off of somebody else's dime, someone who's expecting some form of authority to tell them what to do. This means it's kind of an infantilization, it's turning people into infants, and etymologically, infants, no voice, people who have
What?
no capacity.
Sorry, Maria Lucía, what is the word in Spanish?
Atenidos.
Atenidos, all right.
Atenidos. It's kind of it's quite a Colombian expression. It's almost slang. And it just means that people who refuse to. And when you think about the vice president of a country telling poor people who are asking for institutional measures to diminish, the increasing precariousness of life, you think, well, this is very problematic. So when these people who are impoverished, who don't have a formal tie to the job market, who have no financial security, ask for help and go out on the streets to seek out solidarity, charity, some form of work, the atenido, those who are not responsible, become responsible. Yeah, they become the object of kind of shaming. They are the ones spreading the virus. They are the ones that constitute a danger for community. They are the ones who should be taking out of society. And so this is a way of humiliating people who are already vulnerable, already silenced systematically. Another case of this humiliating discourse happened merely a month ago, where the Minga, which is a word coming from Quechua, a native language in the Americas, a Minga is a reunion, a coming together for working. 8,000 people from indigenous communities in the southwest of Colombia gathered to ask the government for solutions because, well, we live in a country where since the signing of the peace treaty, over 1,000 social leaders have been killed. And I will come back to this a bit later. Since the start of 2020, 100 massacres have occurred. And this is not an exaggeration. 100 massacres have happened on Colombian territory. This kind of makes you think that the pandemic is not the worst thing to have happened this year on our territory. And you know, the idea that this is a war when you have 100 massacres happening a year kind of shifts. So 8,000 people gathered together and traveled from the southwest of the country to the capital. This is hundreds of kilometers, to demand from the government action and solutions regarding social leader killings, the precarious conditions of the indigenous communities, the pollution and the waste of the land. And one of the things that happened is that this country, the president says, I will not meet with the Minga, mostly because they constitute a locus of infection. They are, you know, the bringers of the pandemic, of the illness. They become a danger to society because they are gathered here. Now, this is not exclusive to Colombia, and we can see that throughout the year, different political protests have been called locus of infection by different governments, mostly governments who have not done enough to contain the virus. And so this way of translating, you know, political protest into dangers for society becomes a humiliating discourse. So the president did not meet with the Minga. They had to go back to their territories unheard, unattended, uncared for, and also doubly made responsible for the expansion of the virus. So this is a very complicated thing, because when we say things like somebody is responsible for spreading the virus, and you have a social group who has historically been marginalized, and this must be said, the biopolitical description of indigenous people as locus of infection, as a danger to civilization, as contrary to sanity, is not the first time that in Colombia or in any country that has been a colony has been used. And so it latches on into a racist and colonial imaginary that becomes very, very difficult to combat after the pandemic. So the pandemic has served to strengthen a colonial and racist imaginary. This is very difficult. The second kind of discourse was conceptualized by Colombian philosopher Catalina González, and it is called the Cynical Rhetoric. And cynical rhetoric is a way of displacing the normal meaning of words, you know, of evading the kind of moral and political consequences of ways of speaking, or by substituting them with, you know, the semantic field of an expression in order to make a different sense of the world as what an accurate description would do. So we have different types of cynical rhetoric, and we have what I've called euphemistic substitution. And I've talked before about, you know, how war substitutes pandemic for a context in which death is something that is foreseeable, it is justifiable, it is something that is not so bad because we have been at war for a century, so we know that people die. That's just the way things go. And this, I know how this sounds. It is horrifying to be accustomed to death. I will come back to that a bit later. We have heard of the virus as the enemy. So the enemy is non-human, is a radical other, is something that should and will be eliminated at any cost. The priority is to eliminate it. It creates a sense of community where nothing else is shared but the common enemy. And we in Colombia have had centuries of searching for this internal enemy, whether it be FARC, whether it be ELN, whether it be right now the virus, and later on we will see what it will be, so that the virus as the enemy has this particularity that it is a non-entity. You cannot isolate the virus from the people who have the virus. And so one of the very worrying things about this metaphor, the analogy, as Divya has said, the euphemistic substitution of the virus as an enemy, is that it creates enemies of the people who are infected. And as I've said before, the indigenous communities, the impoverished people, the persons, and for example, sexual workers have become the new enemies of society. And it has also promoted the idea of a unity of society, of a whole unified front against the common enemy, which, well, we will see is very problematic in itself. And another case of euphemistic substitution, which has been, become a theme for many people in many places, the idea of the medical personnel as heroes, almost as the sacrificial figure, somebody who's willing to give their life and who should not demand justice or just treatment. But now, in the fourth phase of the pandemic that they tell us we are in the new normality, now we have the euphemistic substitution under the tag personal responsibility. We have been told that the virus is not only an enemy, that the pandemic is not only a war, but we have been brought the idea of personal responsibility, which brings an imaginary, this very liberal, capitalist ideal of an individual who is self-subsisting, self-controlling. He has autonomy, independence. We can choose our own way of living and of dying, we're saying. And what is this substituting? Well, the idea that the virus is mostly unpredictable, uncontrollable, that we are in a moment, and perhaps a very lasting moment, of uncertainty. So the fact that not only Colombia, but all the world, but here where there are very few concrete measures planning for a future, has just become a leitmotif to say, you have to be responsible for yourself. You have to be responsible for the others. You are, an autonomous being that can control this, is just a way of substituting the need for institutional modification and discussion. So the dissipation of responsibility at the institutional level and the idea that we are autonomous and in control has the contradictory effect, has the planned effect of making the people that become sick guilty of it, of evading the institutional responsibility of the spread of the virus, because, well, it was those kids who were a party, it was those people who decided to protest for their rights, it was those people who did not wear the mask, etc., and not a collective responsibility. Whether we have linguistic or semantic or even moral tools for talking about collective responsibility, well, that is something that we have to find out. But right now, what seems to be the case is we're evading all talk of collective responsibility and centering it on individuality. Well, the third type.
María Lucía, you have 5 minutes left.
That's all I need. The third type of cynical, discursive device is what we could call platitudes or hollow speech. And this has two forms. I think one is the most common, and I think all countries in the world are saying things like, we will all come out of this together, which if we analyze linguistically means nothing. We have no idea what we all denotes. We don't know who we are, we all, especially through humiliating discourse, we're taking out of the we, poor people, vulnerable people, indigenous communities, third world countries. Who is this we are talking about? We don't know. And we don't know what this, we will overcome it. What is the it? The isolation, the impoverishment, the illness, the virus. So this is a platitude, and platitudes could be described as linguistic means to bring peace of mind, to, there's an expression in Spanish, it's not easy to translate, hacer como si, pretend as if, act as if we were doing anything. So platitudes are invading our day-to-day lives. We are saying things like, we are solidary, be solidary with those around you and stay at home, despite being hungry, despite being sick, despite being impoverished. And it has been replacing, in Colombia, it's very evident that a certain politics of charity has replaced a politic of social justice. Instead of promoting universal wage, universal minimum wage for everybody, we have been called to donate. Oh, please donate your clothes, your time, your money, etc., to replace, the responsibility. But the one that is most, I think is most interesting and most worrisome is hollow language around the kind of epidemiology and number-centered speech. And I just want to give some numbers to see that we think that we are saying a lot of things that can be understood by speaking in numbers when we have actually no tools for understanding numbers. As I've said, in Colombia, since January, there have been 100 massacres. 100, over 100. This is almost one a day. And a massacre which the government has called, by euphemism, collective murder, is something that we cannot understand. Right now in Colombia, we have 34,563 deaths. We don't know what that means, and I want to give some context. Colombia is a country that has been at war for so long and has had a level of atrocity and of death that we do not have the ability to understand numbers. For 8 years of government of an ex-president, 2,800 young men were kidnapped, murdered, and disguised as members of FARC by members of our army. 2,800. And they were called isolated instances. No systematicity was allowed to these killings. We have had 6 million internally displaced people. We find, burial grounds of hundreds of bodies. So it is very hard to understand the dimension, of death, of illness, merely by numbers. And one of the things I think is very worrisome is that we're substituting, or we're replacing rich ways of understanding linguistically the experience and the vulnerability brought by the pandemic for numbers. So we hear every day, no, well, today there were 200, 300 dead. And we have not made time for, and I think Divya comes to this, to make, to give way for an imaginative and narrative way of understanding the pandemic. So we are taking refuge in this hollow speech, a hollow speech of numbers, of replacing history for epidemiology. And I think that's very, very worrisome. And I think that this is to become a tendency, and in Colombia, it is a tendency. We are not going to be able to make sense, not now and not afterwards. We're not going to be able to make an exercise in historical memory of the pandemic. So I think those are like the three main ways in which language and politics take a special nuance in a conflicted country. Thank you very much for giving me the time to speak.
Thank you so much, María Lucía. This is a brilliant analysis, bringing in local context to this global discussion. Thank you for your analysis on humiliating, cynical rhetorics, and then ending with platitudes that we are also hearing all across the board. I think your analysis has really brought about the element of context and the importance to hear the words that we use in echo to local context. And in a sense, this is very political because then it allows you to unpack the discursive devices, as you call them, from policymakers who fail to respond to the crisis, not only the pandemic in your case, but many other problems of violence. So now, colleagues and friends, we still have 15 minutes of discussion before we wrap up. So it's ideal and equal for all panelists. Let us open the floor. I have no particular question at the moment, but what I am tempted to raise to María Lucía is, do you think the ethical dimension of this crisis has been sufficiently clarified? You've talked about numbers, you've talked about epidemiological discourses, political discourses humiliating others. But what about the ethical dimensions? Have you heard around the world, or even in Colombia, any groups, any leaders who have underlined the ethical dimension in this crisis, vis-a-vis the poorest, vis-a-vis the most vulnerable, vis-a-vis the indigenous people? What have been your experience in that regard? Also building on your background in ethics and bioethics as well. Over to you.
Well, I have to say that, well, the first thing is, there have been tacit or implicit, ethical compromises in different discourses. One of the most worrying things, and I try to say it, the ethical idea of self-sufficiency and autonomy, of personal responsibility, has been overwhelmingly heard all over the globe. And that contrasts very much with, as I was telling Divya, different ways of viewing the world that usually come from unheard voices, from traditionally unheard voices. I think it's very interesting to notice that in opposition, as one would say, and somebody would think that this is a political way of speaking of it, but I think it's intrinsically related to an ethical point of view. Strengthening communitary and small, not the public, not the institutional, not the statewide thing, but the community kind of viewpoint is an ethical commitment that has proven not only effective in terms of mitigation of the spread, but that has also mitigated the inequalities that have become strengthened by the pandemic. So the ethical compromises, there have been a lot of ethical compromises in dealing with the pandemic. Coming from bioethics, the questions usually come from, well, what are we to do? Who are we to save? When we have, limited resources, how can we live with the possibility of letting somebody die? One of the main issues I have been exploring is we have not been told that our actions have very much to do with exposing certain people, not only the vulnerable ones, to damage, but I think to the healthcare personnel to moral damage. I work with a lot of nurses and a lot of doctors, and one of the things that they tell me is that the moral burnout from months and months of dealing with the pandemic and seeing people not really considering them as human, as vulnerable to damage, is very hard. And I think that has not been sufficiently said. We have, and this has to do with what I was asking Divya, we have to ask ourselves whether it is not only politically convenient and possible, but also if it is ethically desirable to aspire to a united world. I think that there are many ways in which plurality is not really very much allowed in a unified world. And I think that maybe we should look back or look to the communitary and the small scale initiatives before we look to the grand scale globalized initiatives. So I think, yeah, ethically, the question is, what kind of lives do we think are, do we want to live? The question is intrinsically political, I think, but it has not been a question asked by those in power. I think we are asking what we can do and not what we would want, how we would want to live. And I think that's a dimension of the question that's very complicated. I think that Divya has a lot to say on that issue, because when she said, I'm just very anxious to hear what she has to say about this idea of the democracy of the world, because I think that has very much to do with your question.
Thank you so much. So Divya, but also Ali Benmakhlouf, please feel free to chip in at any moment. Divya, don't forget that we have put a question, a very big question on hold. What end of the world is possible? What other end of the world is possible? I think that is a very, very good question. And also, Ali, please chip in at any time to participate as well. I have, in the meantime, a question to you, María Lucía. What do you think about the hollow language being, in fact, the language of bioprotocols and biosecurity?
Oh,
I think
yes.
you've said that indeed it is the language of epidemiology taking over from history. I think that is the kind of question that you have.
Yes, well, I think bioprotocol and biosecurity are kind of a spectacularization of nothingness, of saying nothing. Very much alike, I read one somewhere that very much alike with what happened with the war on terror. A lot of different devices were just put into place to make people feel safe. So we have to go to an airport, have a full body scan, take off our shoes, take out, whatever water we were drinking. This doesn't really make any difference in terms of the capability of bringing down a plane, I think, but the kind of all spectacle around it makes you feel comfortable, makes you feel safe, because, well, safety is mostly a perceptual thing. So biosecurity and bioprotocols are the same thing. I think it's just it's a kind of a spectacle that's being put forth. I don't know in other countries, I can only speak for my country, but most of the biosecurity protocols that I know of are a rag drenched in chlorine on the floor and a thermometer which always, pointed at your wrist, that always has said to me that I am colder than dead. So that really does not work. So one of the things that are very worrisome is that the reactivation of the economy, going back to school, bringing out the people who work in construction, who work in the flower industry, not flower sellers but flower growers, people who work on farms, in order to make them to make it appear as though we are doing something, we say with biosecurity protocols, which doesn't really mean anything, because people get sick, they have no coverage, they have no opportunity to actually isolate. And I think that it's very worrisome, because I think every day more words, many of which you said at the beginning, are just hollow speech. Bioprotocol, safety protocol, telework, these are just ways of saying nothing to make us feel like we're doing something. And that's what I would want to say about that thing.
All right, thank you so much. So Divya, would you like to come in? I have a comment in the box saying that unity is not unified. There's no opposition between unity and pluralism. So let me hear from Divya, coming back to that question of imagining a unified world. What does it mean? Over to you, Divya.
Thank you for that last comment. I will be able to check later on who made the comment, but thank you. I've been listening very intently to everything that María Lucía has said, which is very important. Let me start by trying to answer quickly the questions that she has raised, and the one about the end of the world. And then I have a question for Lucía. globalization is as contradictory, I would say, as the terms local and local plurality. And the reason I say that is, first of all, when we think of the one world, this is a reality in this sense that even the borders, which are to a large extent now normalized national borders, so we've had for the past century a regime of nation states, one should actually say more than the past century. And at the same time, when we look at the most recent phase of globalization compared to the early phases in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries onwards, and then with the colonial regimes in various parts of the world, what we have today is an understanding between powers in different parts of the world that while there will be a uniformity, for instance, in technological adoption, and there will be a uniformity in the financial, the world's financial systems, which is what actually governs the lives of most people in the world, and also dispenses the miseries and the atrocities and inequalities that I referred to and that María Lucía spoke of at length, then we realize that what we have here is not a contradiction. We have a certain system, a very specific system in which what appears to be and is the regional differences, pluralities, and inequalities is actually being managed and organized at a global level. And this is my question later to Lucía, to talk a little bit more about what she thinks, what Lucía, you think about why ways of talking about the pandemic, such as calling it, or ways of talking about the many deaths that you referred to as isolated incidents. This is exactly verbatim what is said in India by the governments. And I'm certain that this is said in many, many other countries of the world by their governments. In other words, the cynicism, the platitudes that you have analyzed are themselves the stock phrases and terms through which almost all countries are speaking to their citizens. Almost all states are speaking to their citizens. This uniformity is a fact. The fact that when the pandemic, when a virus outbreak happens in one part of the world, it impacts all other parts of the world, even if not all of them go into a lockdown, even if not all of them have the same rates of death or disease, their economies suffer to different extents. The reason for that is that the pandemic is experienced along channels which are pre-existing. They are channels where countries and regions are unequal to each other, and also where within the same country, citizens are affected in very unequal ways. So the millions of people that you also referred to as displaced, and those who felt the worst brunt of the pandemic, those who could not stop working, unlike some of us who could work from home and have seminars from home. These are all old inequalities. They are in fact old racisms. And we must globally recognize the caste system in India as perhaps the oldest form of racism, because of which migrant laborers were the ones worst affected by the state and the way it mismanaged the relief for the pandemic. And that shows that the same dangers of unitary, fixed, and oppressive arrangements that can happen through what is formally called globalization, the economic and technological arrangements of globalization. These are the same ones that are also happening at the local level. There is no contradiction or no opposition between the global and the local, between the that which seeks to uniformalize the world and unify it and make it unitary on the one hand, and that which seeks to make it plural. And here I would also include the consequences of the entire discourse of post-colonialism, because post-colonialist discourse has been used by nation states like India to ensure that the inequalities inside India have been kept hidden, while India as an identity, being Indian as an identity of an erstwhile colony, is able to seek certain rights and certain positions of speech in the world. So this complex way in which whether we make a demand for globalization or for localization, there are deeper and hidden dangers, which are what we need to analyze now. In that sense, what I would like to speak of within the given language, which is when I speak of a one world, is to first of all recognize how the whole world is interconnected while maintaining these differences, whether the differences be the ones that we want to celebrate and preserve, or the differences that we want to eradicate because they are contrary to social justice. There are reciprocal causes and effects that link all of us. And if we are confronted with problems like poverty, exclusion, or climate, I find it difficult to think of how we could confront any of these problems by looking only for local solutions. Because the problem's source is not local. The source is already global. And the powers that run this global arrangement are just inordinately more powerful than what can be organized at a local level. But Lucía, I would like you to talk a little bit more about how you understand why this language through which the pandemic has been discussed and the way deaths which are pre-existing, the violences and atrocities that are pre-existing, are treated with the same language, no matter which language it is. The idiom and the strategies remain the same. And where do they come from? About the question of the other world. Maybe I can come to it later because I don't want to take a lot of time and I want to hear.
So we have only 5 minutes left. So I'd like María Lucía to be able to respond. And then immediately after María Lucía, I'd like to come back to Ali Benmakhlouf, because in the abécédaire that he has presented and proposed, there's a missing word which is coming up very clearly now more and more, which is vaccination. So Ali, I'd like to hear from you as well what kind of issues we have to take into account and discuss and put it on the table when it comes to vaccination moving forward. So María Lucía, over to you, and then to Ali.
I will be very brief. I just want to say to Divya that maybe I'm making a very strange use for philosophers of the notion of contradiction, and I did not mean it as a negative thing, but rather as a very interesting thing. You know, the tensions between the local and the global, and globalization, and the fact that the world is in fact one, seems to be contradictory with the experience of being isolated. And I think that's very interesting, and I thank you very much for taking the time to answer that, because I think you put it marvelously. I think one of the very important questions that we have to ask ourselves is whether what makes the world unified is the sharing of problems, sharing of the structure of oppressions, for example, from a decolonial or post-colonial point of view, whether what makes the world one as an entity is not an actual, coming together, but of being vulnerable to the same evils. And I think that's a very interesting thing. My interest on the local ways of speaking about this is that despite the language being not new and not exclusive, it brings forth, I think, in a sense, what you called an isolation, because we can be speaking about the same terms, and I can tell you this is the way in which war is used to speak of the pandemic. This is the way in which they tell us that the massacres committed by the police force or by the army are merely isolated incidents, but there is something that is lost in translation, as I said. And I think it's very important to not forget that the structure, this what you have called the stock of phrases, sometimes makes it seem as though we have a shared language, and maybe just it functions merely as internet memes. We repeat the same formula, but we understand not exactly the same thing. We laugh because of different contexts. And one of the things I'm worried about is that, being from a third world country, what we understand through it is not usually what comes through in decision-making processes at the global or at the wider spread level. So I think that it's important to talk about not only the languages, and you said it beautifully, not only what is said, but what has to be, what remains unsaid, untranslatable. And I think therein lies the most potent way of becoming, and I agree, I did not mean unity precludes plurality, but it makes it a challenge. How do we share experiences more than just by sharing a stock of phrases? And I think, thank you for your intervention. You make a very, more than I do, a very clear way of setting that tension between global, local, and historic.
Thank you, María Lucía.
Thank you
the conversation
so much.
continues, of course. Let me invite in Ali Benmakhlouf on the word vaccination or vaccines. What do you think?
Oui, merci Phinith, c'est un mot, il est vrai, très important. J'aurais pu effectivement l'inclure dans mon abécédaire, comme vous avez pu dire. Il se trouve qu'à l'Académie de pharmacie, l'an dernier, nous avons rendu un rapport sur la vaccination que tous les participants peuvent maintenant consulter sur le site de l'Académie nationale de pharmacie. Et on l'a rendu en février, donc le travail concernait les années antérieures et pas spécialement la pandémie, mais je vais quand même dire des choses spécifiques à la pandémie et ce que nous avons pu conclure de la vaccination. Pour la pandémie actuelle, il est vrai que, je l'ai dit rapidement tout à l'heure, les pays pensent mondial, c'est-à-dire une pandémie qui envahit toutes les contrées, mais agissent, il est vrai, localement. Et pour les vaccins, on aurait pu souhaiter, il est vrai, qu'il y ait plus de concertation entre les pays pour que ne s'installe pas dans la population cette idée délétère que les vaccins sont développés dans une optique de rivalité pour favoriser telle ou telle industrie pharmaceutique. Parce qu'il est vrai que dès lors qu'une suspicion s'installe, il y a malheureusement après une faible adhésion, ou en tous les cas une adhésion qui n'est pas globale à la vaccination. Il faut savoir quelques chiffres tout de même. 2 à 3 millions, on considère qu'aujourd'hui 2 à 3 millions d'enfants sont sauvés chaque année par la vaccination. Que des pays comme l'Ukraine et le Congo, où il y a une situation de guerre, on meurt de nouveau de la rougeole. Et il y a ainsi des situations où véritablement il y a un recul sur la vaccination. On considère que le continent européen est aujourd'hui le continent le plus défiant à l'égard de la vaccination. Pourquoi tout cela? Beaucoup de raisons, en particulier une fragmentation de la confiance dans la vaccination, parce que précisément, il y a toute une campagne menée par des opposants. Ils ne sont pas nombreux, mais ils ont beaucoup de surface médiatique. En France, par exemple, on considère qu'il n'y a pas plus de 2% d'opposants radicaux à la vaccination, mais il y a 17% de la population qui hésite. Et donc, ça veut dire qu'il y a une communication qui n'est pas bien faite. Il y a plusieurs biais cognitifs. Et l'un des biais cognitifs les plus grands, c'est le faible intérêt pour les statistiques. Je vais vous donner un exemple. En France, par exemple, on considère que le risque le plus grand est le risque nucléaire. Il est placé en 21e place pour les scientifiques. Il est placé en première place par l'ensemble de la population. Et en général, l'évaluation des risques n'est pas faite de la même façon par le grand nombre et par les scientifiques. Il y a véritablement un problème. Vous avez entendu comme moi, puisqu'on est dans le langage, que très souvent les gens parlent d'effets secondaires du vaccin. Je tiens à rappeler que la terminologie exacte, ce sont les effets indésirables et les événements secondaires. Les effets indésirables, c'est quand il y a localement sur la place de la vaccination un peu de sensibilité, un peu de fièvre le jour même de la vaccination. Ça, c'est des effets indésirables. Mais les événements secondaires, c'est quand advient un événement très grave. On considère que moins de 0,0001% concerne les événements secondaires. Mais ils sont surévalués, comme pour le risque nucléaire, surévalués par la population. Autre chose, les gens confondent la causalité et la corrélation. Il arrive qu'une personne vaccinée, quelques mois après, déclare une maladie grave. Il y a une proximité temporelle, et la proximité temporelle est rapportée à une causalité. Voilà l'ensemble de choses qui font que, il est vrai que les gens ont développé une défiance à l'égard de la vaccination, mais la vaccination, avec l'hygiène, avec les antibiotiques, est responsable d'une augmentation de l'espérance de vie multipliée par 3 depuis 100 ans, mais on ne dit pas assez que la vaccination est liée à l'espérance de vie et on surévalue la défiance à son sujet.
Énormément merci à Ali Benmakhlouf pour ces précisions vitales, je dirais, sans jeu de mots, parce que les semaines et les mois qui viennent, ou les années même, devra se poser la question de combattre d'autres idéologies autour de la vaccination contre cette pandémie, très certainement. Chers amis, chers collègues, nous avons maintenant dépassé de 7 minutes la fin de cette conférence. Je voudrais simplement pour ma part faire deux choses. Poser 3 questions, puisque nous sommes entre philosophes, ne pas conclure, mais poser les questions, et enfin terminer avec quelques précisions et invitations. Les interrogations d'abord, permettez-moi de passer à l'anglais. I'd like to finish with 3 interrogations. First one, around the terms vulnerability and responsibility. And the question is, who is responsible of the systematic vulnerability of some communities? Who is responsible of the systematic vulnerability of some communities? And I think María Lucía has responded partly to this ethical question. My second question, which is an open question as well, is between context and pretext. How should social scientists deconstruct discourses to fight ideology? And I think this is a very, very important question relating back as well to Ali Benmakhlouf's notion of public deliberation or democratic deliberation, which is very important to contextualize in order to avoid pretext. So context and pretext, I think we need to unpack that as part of the political science or political philosophy as well. And then the last question between nuances, precision, which doesn't mean certainty. You know, our attachment, the importance of nuances and precision within this pandemic is extremely important, but that doesn't mean that we have certainty. Precision doesn't mean certainty, as Ali Benmakhlouf has reminded. So the question is, are we prepared enough to deal and to bear complexity in the world to come? So this is my last open question. Now let me just invite you to the next roundtable, which will be tomorrow, 20th of November. We'll be discussing another important theme, which is health as a philosophical issue. You are all invited to join that online conference as well tomorrow at 11 a.m. Paris time, which is GMT +1. At the end of my discussion, at the end of this roundtable, let me invite my colleagues as well at UNESCO headquarters to collate all the questions that have been raised but not necessarily answered. And I know that many of you have asked also the bibliography or references that you have quoted, and we'll be very glad if you speakers could also avail your written communication or written presentation today. It will be very, very appreciated by participants to also read in details your references and your text. Thank you so much, Ali Benmakhlouf. Thank you, Divya, Dwivedi, and thank you, María, Lucía, Rivera, Sanín. It has been a pleasure for us and an honor as well to unpack all these categories, and we hope that the world to come and the unborn categories will point to some hope to overcome this pandemic, maybe not together, or at least together, but with the whole complexity that surrounds our world. Thank you so much, colleagues, and keep safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.